We have just shown our viewers photos of joint military exercises of the Belarusian army and some Chinese units. The Chinese came to visit Belarus, near Brest, near the border with Poland. Some military maneuvers are being launched, and these maneuvers will be held until July 19th. Quite a long exercise. In your opinion, again, the time when this event was planned by the Belarusian Ministry of Defense synchronously with the NATO summit, the format of this event, what does it indicate to us? And have we seen similar manifestations of close cooperation between Minsk and Beijing in the military direction before?
In this manifestation, no. Everything is much more complicated, and this is a large structure of the PRC, which concerns the development of a huge autocratic bloc. We have to weigh absolutely everything that is happening, and here it probably needs to be explained as simplified as possible. Look, China is actively bringing Russia to North Korea. They restored the system of collective security. North Koreans can serve the goals of the Russian army in Ukraine, and Russia received the right to deploy its troops on the territory of the DPRK. At the same time, Russia is already threatening the Philippines and preparing to participate in the war over Taiwan. At the same time, China is actively expanding its presence in Eastern Europe. That is, earlier these were agreements and declarations. Now we see that they have integrated Belarus into their systems. Belarus will join BRICS in October in Kazan, which joined the SCO. The SCO, a Central Asian story, now extends to the border of Ukraine. It is worth emphasizing this many times here. And immediately after Belarus joined the SCO, we began these exercises. Moreover, many different kinds of events were held the day before, because there was also a meeting of the Ministry of Defense of Belarus with representatives of the People's Liberation of the Chinese Army in Minsk. Their new minister, Ryzenkov, who seems to be from Belarus, immediately went to Beijing to raise the level of economic, financial, and defense relations. The Chinese were brought to some parades of the independence of Belarus. There were a lot. I don't think they were going anywhere. They joined those who arrived by military planes. I also suspect that we were not shown all the Chinese who came. And now, again, another military delegation from Beijing has come to Minsk to talk about military education and training of Belarusian officers. Against this broad background, it should be understood that Belarus is now directly subordinate to Beijing, not Moscow. And this is confirmed, in fact, by the huge embassy of the People's Republic of China that opened in Minsk. This building is much larger than the Russian embassy in Belarus. In fact, it looks like the Ministry of Administrative Affairs. And accordingly, Belarus is now behaving in such a way that it is now a direct vassal of China, not Russia. Here is the Russian aspect. This is another topic, which is also very broad. What we should pay attention to is that now Chinese troops are doing incomprehensibly not only on the NATO border, but also on the border of Ukraine, because it's somewhere in the area of this Brest region, from Brest to Pinsk. It's not that far from Kiev, and yesterday morning, when they started the official training, there was a big shelling of Ukraine with terrible events in Kiev. And, obviously, the Chinese were watching all this. They are not so far from us. And this only confirms that all the attacks that Russia is currently carrying out on Ukraine are verified in Beijing. And then there's the Orban story, which also needs to be talked about a little separately.
We will definitely talk about the Orban story now. Another clarifying question regarding the appearance of Chinese troops in Belarus, albeit in the format of exercises so far. But we know that the invasion of Ukraine from Belarus also took place under the guise of exercises. Over the past short period of time, we have had a number of statements regarding the possible appearance of North Korean troops already directly in our occupied territories, near the front, and, possibly, the involvement of these troops in hostilities. Now there is also a Chinese factor. So far on the territory of Belarus, let's say, that is, can we actually predict an increase in the presence of military, the presence of Chinese troops in Belarus for a long period? Or will the training end on July 19th? They will curtail everything and go home?
North Korean history is a slightly different track. Here it is worth preparing for the appearance of North Koreans. Even if they do not appear, Ukraine must be ready for anything. As for the PRC, this is my long-term forecast. It has been there for a long time. In the near future, maybe for years, or maybe for months, the PRC will have a permanent deployment of troops in Belarus one way or another. Because the contractual framework that exists between Lukashenko and Xi, it actually removes the PRC as a guarantor of the security of Belarus. She also claims to be the guarantor of the security of all of Europe, which also applies to Ukraine. To be sure, she will not miss the opportunity to deploy troops on NATO's land border, especially given that he believes he can respond in this way to expanding democratic military alliances in the Indo-Pacific Massif. And let's also remember that she promised to punish Lithuania, to punish Estonia. These are the same as many times their statements were made by both the government and propaganda. It should be understood that this is a real threat to the Latvian state.
To punish, I mean for cooperation with Taiwan, as I understand it. Or for what?
Not only that, but in general, these countries have the leading status of the struggle against the Chinese Communist Party, as well as the whole of Central Europe. That is, it is absolutely unacceptable for a region of Eastern Europe to work fruitfully with the PRC. This is Orban's way. But, of course, the Baltic countries are exemplary here. Well, there are a lot of threats. And we also need to prepare to understand that this is our reality. Chinese troops are already on the border with Ukraine. That's how they train. But, you are right, we have already seen what such training is carried out for.
We see China entering Europe through Belarus, but not only. Another safe haven for, let's say, the growth and strengthening of Chinese influence is Hungary. Here, Viktor Orban is openly friends with both Xi Jinping and Beijing. And the other day, again, the Prime Minister of Hungary visited Beijing. After a 2-month break, only recently Xi Jinping was on a visit to Budapest. 2 months have passed. In fact, Viktor Orban is already in Beijing. Orban said during this visit that he considers China a key force in creating conditions for peace in Russia's war against Ukraine. That's why I came to meet with President Xi in Beijing. And Orban called his visit the third stop of the peace mission, Kiev-Moscow. Beijing took a ride on this route. Orban drove. And again, what important things did we hear publicly as a result of this visit? And the geography of this Orban route is not accidental, is it?
Absolutely. Of course, at first it looked quite obvious what was happening, but now everything is crystallizing. Now, however, he is already flying, as I understand it, to the NATO summit in Washington. And what is the most important thing we need to understand? Orban's visit to Beijing demonstrated very clearly that the PRC is fully involved in the Russian war in Ukraine. If he talks about the war, then he is a peacekeeper there, and he went to China. And it would seem, what does the PRC have to do with it? But this is a direct connection with the main sponsor of Russia, with the main beneficiary of the Russian war. Yesterday I got acquainted with the document published by European Pravda. They say they have received Orban's letter to the European Commission. And, if what is written there is true, then I see a fairly clear logic in all this. That is, what is Orban doing now?
Я бачу досить чітку логіку в цьому всьому. Тобто, що нині робить Орбан?
He is trying to promote the idea of a Beijing peace conference, which was previously openly supported by Russia. Russia, on the other hand, says that they are ready to arrange peace talks under the moderation of Xi Jinping. Now Orban says that this is the best way, and that this will happen. He emphasized Putin's demands for 2022. They are not realistic. And in fact, he says, you don't like these demands, go to Beijing. Beijing will reject most of these points of Putin and Russia and offer something that will be most beneficial to the PRC. This, of course, applies to the occupation of Ukrainian territories. Actually, he goes on to emphasize that there will be victims. These threatening theses, which are really annoying, because it is already difficult for our people to read all this, of course. But what I'm getting at is that there are actually threats here, and the escalation will continue to intensify there. In fact, when Orban voiced everything he heard from the president of Ukraine and the position of Ukraine, immediately after that we saw what happened yesterday with the heavy shelling of Ukraine. And, once again, the big connection between everything Russia does and verification by Beijing.
Arthur, the last question, it concerns not so much China as India, another major player, and, in particular, in this BRICS association and, in general, in the world economy, in the Asian region. Narendra Modi, Prime Minister of India, visited Putin in Moscow, Novo-Goroyovo, Putin's dacha. He posted a corresponding tweet thanking Putin for this warm welcome and promoting Indian-Russian friendship, blah, blah, blah. All these ceremonial things. Let's say, actually, we see the official Russian video of the meeting between the Prime Minister of India and the Kremlin dictator. After all, the contacts between India and Russia have never stopped, but we can draw some kind of parallel or compare them with the Chinese ones. They have a completely different character here as well. First of all, we are talking about the economy, at least that's how the world media wrote that. First of all, Modi in Moscow will discuss, in particular, the mechanism of fast money transfers, financial transactions between India and Russia, again, oil exports, and other important issues. So why is this visit, in fact, taking place now? Although it was planned, Modi did not cancel it after yesterday's terrorist attacks on Kiev. And, in fact, what will they agree on?
I think that he is still in Moscow. There are a lot of statements there. It is really of an economic nature. I think politically, Modi in general was extremely uncomfortable doing everything he does, despite everything we see on the screen right now. These are India's approaches to diplomacy. I would not say that this is a story about India's overly pro-Russian views, but they are not easy to understand, and there is really a lot to talk about it. But here it is important to emphasize that while Modi was on the plane, Russia carried out its terrorist act. And, in fact, Modi became the first international leader to meet a few hours after the Russian attack on the Akhmedid hospital, on the Adonis hospital, on all this civilian infrastructure, and with all the victims that we, unfortunately, have. And I think it's important to emphasize this. That is, even if India did not want this, they did not make adjustments, and this is on their conscience. We must understand this.
На жаль, є. І я думаю, що це важливо підкреслити. Тобто, навіть якщо Індія цього не хотіла, вони коректив не внесли, і це на їхній совісті. Ми маємо це розуміти.
But we have to understand that India is not China. India itself understands that China is preparing to attack its territory, taking into account all the security tracks that exist.
Тобто, все одно важливо Україні працювати з Індією і робити все, щоб зв'язки Індії і Росії ставали меншими.
Indeed, relations between Russia and India cannot be crammed into old slogans from Soviet times. Indi-Rus-Fa-Fi. This is propaganda that now seems anachronistic, but in fact, there is a certain pragmatics in these relations. For Russia, India is also a market, in particular, another market for its oil products, as a matter of fact, and first of all, these relations are of an economic nature. We need to really work in this direction, develop our relations with India and, in fact, really take advantage of the opportunities that arise in these relations. Artur, thank you very much for this conversation, for including Artur Kharitonov with us. We talked about Asia, about the East, about China, India, Modi's visits to Moscow, and, in fact, the appearance of Chinese troops in Belarus is the most alarming. This is obviously one of the most important news of today, that Belarus and China have already started joint military exercises on the border not only with Poland, but close to the borders of our state, not far from the Novovolinsk region. So this is a direct threat.